Frost had already begun creeping up the windowsill, but what suffocated Kestrel Vale wasn't the cold, it was the dead silence ruling the chicken coop. Years earlier, when her father was still alive, this place had greeted every sunrise with restless clucking and vibrant life. But now, it was nothing more than an empty shell holding a few worn nests. The old dog, Brindle, nosed a frozen corner of the coop, then looked up at her with a low whine. Suddenly, from inside the cabin, Mother Ansel's cough tore through the thin plank walls, sounding like a dry branch snapping in the winter night. Kestrel clenched her freezing hands. Winter was closing in on Crowbone Crossing, and the emptiness of this homestead was nothing less than a written death sentence for the two of them. On the rough pine table, Kestrel flattened the receipt of their ruin. Cornmeal, salt, and the expensive cough tonic meant to keep her mother breathing. All that remained on the table was $10. Just a small stack of cold coins. $10 to survive months of incoming blizzards was a cruel joke of fate. Mother Ansel coughed softly, pulling the patched quilt higher. She glanced at the meager sum, then turned her tired eyes toward the murky frost outside the window. $10 buys 2 more sacks of flour, she whispered, her voice terrifyingly calm. And then we run empty by midwinter. The frontier winter never spares those who just sit and wait for it, Kestrel. Kestrel stared at the coins. Her mother's words cut through any illusion of safety. 2 sacks of flour was just a way to prolong the despair. They couldn't just consume what little they had left. They needed something that could produce. But how could $10 buy a healthy flock of hens? Just then, the distant tolling of the town's salvage auction bell drifted through the air, the place where people dumped their most worn-out goods. Kestrel grabbed her threadbare coat, swept every last cent off the table, and pushed the door open into the north wind. Playing it safe was no longer an option. She needed a gamble. The sale yard at Crowbone Crossing stood beside an old freight store whose roof had begun to sag under years of snow and dust. Kestrel arrived before noon and kept to the back, while Rusk Tallow, the local auction man, worked through broken harness rings, cracked water buckets, damp grain sacks, and 3 narrow goats with winter already showing in their ribs. Men laughed easily there, because poor goods made poor jokes cheap. Near the end, Rusk hooked 2 fingers under a canvas tarp and pulled it from a low wooden crate pen. 89 hens stood packed inside. Their backs were bare in patches. Their combs hung pale and thin. Some held their eyes open with the dull patience of animals long handled by careless hands. The crowd made its judgment at once. Kestrel did not. Behind the slats, one naked-necked hen looked straight at her. It never clucked. It only blinked. Rusk waited for another bid. None came. He lowered the price once. Then again, boots shifted across the frozen ground, but no one stepped forward. A few men folded their arms as if even looking too closely at the flock might cost them money. Finally, Kestrel raised her hand. The auction ended before anyone expected it would. $10 changed hands. Every coin she had left disappeared into Rusk's palm. Relief crossed his face for only a moment. The burden belonged to someone else. Now, a dry laugh broke from the crowd. Others quickly joined it. Hiram Soot, the village blacksmith, shook his head and called out, $10 for 89 empty stomachs. They'll eat better than you will. More laughter followed. Nobody argued with him. Kestrel simply signed the receipt, walked to the crate, and lifted the first box with steady hands. The chickens barely stirred beneath the rough slats. Brindle circled the wagon quietly, while she loaded each crate one after another. Behind her, the laughter drifted across the yard like dry snow blowing over frozen ground, already convinced the story had reached its ending before the real work had even begun. The hired mule leaned into the traces, while the old wagon sled creaked across the frozen road toward the Vale cabin. Brindle trotted beside the wheels, glancing back at the crates every few steps, as though counting them. Frost gathered along the rough boards, and the north wind slipped through every crack it could find. Inside the boxes, the hens remained almost silent. Every so often, Kestrel caught a faint scrape of weak claws or the quiet rustle of feathers shifting against wood. Those tiny sounds mattered. They meant life had not entirely withdrawn. When the trail dipped toward a frozen creek crossing, she eased the mule to a slower pace. The cargo behind her was no longer merchandise bought at auction. 89 living creatures now depended on every careful mile between the sale yard and home. By the time Kestrel reached her cabin, the story had already arrived at Bram Cox's general store. It came with Tobin Wren, a freight hauler who rarely carried a tale exactly as he had found it. Before long, 89 worn-out hens had been exaggerated to nearly 100. The price had somehow become even more foolish. Every telling polished the mistake until it sounded too remarkable to question. Bram listened while measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. He worked the numbers in his head without writing them down. $10 is only the beginning, he said. Feed comes every day. Hiram rested one elbow against the stove and smiled. She'll spend more feeding them than they're worth. Across the room, Orpha Maines, who had raised chickens for most of her life, gave a slow nod. Those chickens won't carry her through Christmas. Several customers agreed before anyone asked whether they had actually seen the flock. Bram tied the coffee sack with twine and set it on the counter. A hungry hen eats whether she lays or not. The room accepted that sentence as settled truth. Outside, the first hard breath of winter drifted over Crowbone Crossing, still too far away for most people to fear, yet already moving in the only direction it ever traveled. Mother Ansel heard the wagon before she saw it. By the time Kestrel opened the first crate, the old woman had already crossed the yard with the help of a worn hickory cane. Every step came slowly, but her eyes remained as sharp as they had been 40 winters earlier. Brindle settled across the doorway, keeping still so the frightened chickens would not bolt into panic. Ansel lifted one hen with practiced hands. She studied the comb first, then the legs, then the clear shine, or lack of it, in the chicken's eyes. Finally, her fingers rested along the breastbone. The ridge felt far too sharp beneath the skin. She lowered the hen gently. "They aren't dying," she said. "They're emptied, nothing more." Kestrel understood, but she reached for neither the feed bucket nor the water pail first. A starving flock could not recover inside a building that leaked its warmth into every gust. The coop had to change before the hens could. She mixed clay, chopped straw, and cold wood ash into a thick mortar, pressing it deep into every crack where daylight slipped through the boards. Old pine planks lifted the nesting straw several inches above the frozen floor so dampness would stay below. She cut new roost poles and fixed them lower than before. Weak hens should never waste strength climbing farther than necessary. Mother Ansel watched for a while before speaking. "Cold reaches farther on moving air than frozen ground." Kestrel nodded and kept working. A coarse burlap sack hung across the doorway. The water trough moved against the inner wall. Outside, she enclosed a modest yard on the southern side of the coop, where the rising sun would warm the earth first, and the cedar fence caught the afternoon wind. Brindle lay quietly nearby, lifting his head whenever a hen wandered too close to fresh mortar. Before leaving the wall, Kestrel placed her hand beside the final repaired seam. Winter had not weakened. It had simply lost one more doorway into the coop. Once the space was ready, the weakest hens were carried into the warmest corner of the coop, where thick straw covered the newly raised planks. Those still able to stand found their way into the small southern yard, protected from the north wind. No hen was hurried. Each one crossed the distance at its own pace. And just like that, Kestrel lifted crate after crate. The real work had finally begun. Kestrel measured every handful before it reached the feeding trough. A body worn down by hunger could suffer from too much food as easily as too little. Recovery depended on balance, and balance could not be rushed. With not a single coin left to buy feed, Kestrel had to gamble with their own meager winter stores. She ground their remaining dry corn into coarse meal and mixed it with lightly toasted oats that had been stored since harvest. Wooden trays beneath the cabin window held sprouted grain, a clever way to stretch a small handful of seed into a larger volume of fresh, green food for an otherwise brown winter diet. A small spoonful of rendered beef tallow scraped from a leftover jar in the kitchen added needed strength without making the mixture heavy. Beside the main feed, She placed crushed oyster shells scavenged for free from old trading barrels and chipped limestone broken with the back of a hammer. Mother Ansel watched the hens gather slowly around the trough. "They'll tell you when they're ready for more," she said. "Listen before you pour." The meals stayed small. 4 modest feedings replaced 1 large one. Chickens that had gone too long without proper care needed steady rhythm more than overflowing troughs. Water demanded equal attention. Each morning, Kestrel wrapped 2 smooth river stones in worn cloth after warming them beside the cook stove. She tucked them beneath the wooden water pan, taking just enough chill away to slow the first layer of ice without heating the water itself. By midday, she replaced them with freshly warmed stones. As Kestrel went about her work, the flock slowly settled into the new rhythm. Near the edge of the flock, the bare-necked hen approached the separate pan of crushed shells. It lowered its head once, then again, then a third time. For several quiet moments it continued picking through the white fragments with patient purpose. When the chicken finally lifted its head, something had changed. The movement carried a trace of confidence, as though its body had remembered a need long buried beneath months of neglect. Kestrel noticed it without a word and reached for another careful handful of feed. The next tool Kestrel built cost nothing at all. She hung a smooth pine board beside the coop door and marked careful columns with a piece of charcoal. Date, wind, water, chicken standing, red combs, new feathers, eggs. Every evening, another line appeared beneath the last one. The board carried no guesses, only what the day had actually revealed. Mother Ansel watched her finish the first row. "Numbers won't spare you," she said quietly, "but they won't lie to you either." The first entries were plain. Wind, north, water, clear, red combs, 0. New feathers, 0. Eggs, 0. Kestrel looked at the final mark for a long moment before lowering the charcoal. Her hand never hesitated. Those zeros were not signs of failure. They were the first honest measure of where the flock truly stood. Tomorrow's line would have to earn the right to be different. The first week passed without a single egg. Each evening, another black 0 appeared on the pine board. Kestrel expected nothing else. Bodies worn down over many months rarely trusted safety after only a few days. On the 4th morning, she found one of the weakest hens lying quietly beneath the low roost. The chicken had slipped beyond saving, sometime before dawn. Kestrel carried it behind the line of old willows, where the frozen ground softened beneath fallen leaves. She buried it with a shovel and covered the small mound before Mother Ansel reached the window. There was no reason to make the old woman watch another farewell. News traveled faster than wagons. By afternoon, Bram's store had already heard that the flock had started dying. Hiram gave a knowing shrug. 89 will become 0 before long. The remark spread through the room with several quiet nods. Back at the coop, Kestrel studied the board instead of the rumor. 1 chicken was gone. 88 remained. 17 now stayed on their feet through the morning feeding without sitting down to rest. 9 had begun scratching the ground instead of waiting beside the trough. The numbers told a different story from the one drifting around Crowbone Crossing. She erased nothing. She added nothing. Setting the numbers aside, Kestrel continued her work. She broke the thin sheet of ice forming along the water pan and replaced the warm stones beneath it. The flock still needed clean water before they needed anyone to feel sorry for them. The 8th morning brought a lesson Kestrel had not expected. Heavy frost had settled across Crowbone Crossing during the night. Inside the coop, the northern corner smelled wrong. She knelt beside the bedding and reached beneath the top layer of straw. Her fingers came away damp. Cold alone rarely destroyed a flock. Cold mixed with moisture worked slowly, quietly, and with far greater patience. Before she could pull away the wet bedding, Brindle barked sharply beside the grain shelf. 2 field mice burst from beneath the sprouted grain trays and darted across the floor. The old dog drove them through the open doorway before returning to stand beside the barrel, still watching. Kestrel remained kneeling beside the damp straw. The walls no longer leaked much wind. That part had worked. The moisture had nowhere to escape. She understood the mistake immediately. Taking her hatchet, she climbed onto a small crate and cut a narrow vent beneath the leeward side of the roof, just wide enough for damp air to leave without inviting the north wind inside. The opening faced away from the strongest weather, allowing the coop to breathe instead of trapping every breath from the flock. Fresh straw replaced every damp bundle. Before spreading it, she sifted a thin layer of cool wood ash across the floorboards. The ash would pull moisture downward before it settled into the bedding. Finally, the sprouted grain trays were lifted from the barrel and suspended overhead with rawhide thongs where mice could no longer reach them. By the following morning, the sharp smell of dampness had almost disappeared. The bedding remained dry beneath the surface, and a faint stream of warm air drifted toward the new roof vent. Winter had uncovered another weakness. Kestrel answered it with a better design. By the third week, the charcoal marks on the pine board still ended with the same final entry: eggs, 0. It also showed something far more important. While making the morning round, Kestrel paused beside the bare-necked hen from the auction. Fine feather shafts had begun pushing through the pale skin along its neck and shoulders. They were short, almost no longer than stiff bristles, yet they had not been there a few days earlier. She looked farther across the flock. Several combs had lost their faded color. They were no longer white with exhaustion. A soft red had begun working its way back, little by little, as though the chickens were remembering what healthy blood was supposed to look like. Near the mineral pan, 2 hens bumped shoulders over the crushed oyster shell. Neither chicken backed away immediately. A brief argument followed before one finally claimed the better place. Across the coop, another scratched through clean straw until it uncovered a forgotten grain kernel and swallowed it with quick satisfaction. The building sounded different. Not loud, not busy. Just alive enough that the silence no longer ruled the room. That evening, Mother Ansel remained in bed while Kestrel closed the coop for the night. The old woman listened quietly through the open cabin window. After several moments, she smiled without opening her eyes. They're talking again. Kestrel glanced toward the fading light beyond the yard. The flock had not laid a single egg yet. Even so, the small voices drifting from the coop carried a promise that numbers alone could not measure. The chickens were no longer merely surviving the days. They were beginning to belong to them. The first eggs appeared on a bitter morning near the end of November. Frost covered the fence rails, and every breath turned white before disappearing into the still air. Kestrel carried her lantern into the coop as she had every morning since the flock arrived. Nothing about her routine changed. She checked the water first, then the bedding, then the chickens. Only after that did she kneel beside the lowest nesting box. 4 eggs rested against the clean straw. She looked at them for several quiet seconds before lifting each one into a folded piece of linen. The shells still held the warmth of the hens that had laid them. Outside, she walked to the pine board and changed the final line. Eggs, 4. No circle, no underline. Just another honest entry. Mother Ansel waited until Kestrel placed the cloth on the kitchen table. The old woman picked up 1 egg with both hands, turning it slowly as though feeling something far older than breakfast. They've crossed the hardest part, she said. Kestrel gave a small nod. 4 eggs could not feed a family. They could not earn back $10, nor could they silence an entire town. The following morning brought 6, then 9. 2 days later, 11. Each number climbed by only a little, but every increase came from the same chickens that had once stood silent inside an auction crate. Crowbone Crossing remained unconvinced. At Bram Calk's store, someone remarked that 11 eggs would not even pay for the corn those hens had already eaten. A few customers laughed softly and returned to their coffee. Kestrel never heard the conversation. She was replacing fresh straw beneath the nesting boxes before daylight faded, knowing that production was not built by celebrating the first success. It was protected by giving tomorrow's eggs every reason to arrive. Winter arrived without waiting for the calendar. The first blast came during the night. The second followed before sunrise. By afternoon, the north wind swept across Crowbone Crossing with enough force to drive loose snow beneath doors and through careless walls. Water pans froze solid. Barn doors refused to open. Every weakness that had gone unnoticed in October suddenly announced itself. At Orphamaine's coop, damp bedding turned cold and heavy. The hens stopped laying almost overnight. Across town, Hiram found 3 chickens dead beneath a perch, where a narrow crack had allowed freezing air to pour across them for hours. His confidence disappeared far more quickly than his laughter had. The weekly stagecoach failed to arrive. Snow blocked the western road for 2 full days, leaving Nola Pike's kitchen nearly out of eggs before the breakfast rush had even ended. Meanwhile, Kestrel did not scramble to change her methods. She simply tightened her defenses. Her inspections doubled, from before daylight until well after sunset. The burlap curtain dropped lower across the doorway whenever the wind lashed out. And to fight the biting cold, each pre-dawn feeding now included a small portion of warm sprouted grain that had rested near the cook stove overnight, taking the sharp chill away without becoming hot. Brindle refused the comfort of the cabin. He paced the coop through the longest hours of darkness, stopping now and then to lift his nose into the wind before circling the building again. Nothing about the little chicken house looked impressive. The walls still leaned, the roof still carried old scars. The repairs were plain enough that few people would have noticed them. Nature did. One system after another around the settlement began surrendering to the cold because each had overlooked a different weakness. Kestrel's coop faced the same storm, with no special protection beyond careful preparation and constant attention. Late that night, another hard gust shook the cabin. Kestrel stepped outside and stood listening beneath a sky bright with winter stars. The wind howled across the open prairie. Inside the coop, a quiet chorus answered it. Soft clucks, gentle rustling, the low conversation of chickens settling together against the cold. The sound was small. It was steady. Most important of all, it was still there. The blizzard moved east before midnight, leaving the prairie strangely quiet. Then Brindle exploded into sharp, furious barking. Kestrel seized the lantern hanging beside the door, grabbed a stout hickory stick, and ran into the bitter cold. Snow reached almost to her knees. The dog stood rigid beside the western wall of the coop, growling into the darkness. A flash of movement. Gray fur. A young coyote slipped away from the light, circled once, then vanished beyond the drifting snow. The hens burst into nervous clucking. Kestrel lowered the lantern toward the ground and found fresh claw marks beneath the wall. Wind-packed snow had forced one of the lower planks outward, just enough to leave a narrow opening. The predator had found it. Another storm might have widened it. She wasted no time. Flat stones from the nearby woodpile were wedged tightly against the foundation. Frozen clay, mixed with chopped straw, sealed the gap before the wind could steal the fresh mortar. Her fingers burned with cold as she pressed every handful into place. Brindle never left his position. He stood between the darkness and the frightened flock, watching every shadow beyond the lantern's reach. Before returning to the cabin, Kestrel tied several empty tin cups to a rawhide line stretched along the western wall. Any push against the boards would rattle the metal and wake both dog and owner. When the lantern finally dimmed, the coop settled once more. No chickens had been taken. Winter had arrived with teeth as well as frost. This time, it had gone hungry. The cold tightened its grip on Crowbone Crossing day after day. Smoke climbed from chimneys that sheltered families, but many chicken coops had already surrendered. Orpha's hens remained quiet. Hiram's surviving flock laid only a handful of eggs across an entire week. Every frozen morning seemed to erase another plan that had looked sensible before winter arrived. For her part, Kestrel patiently maintained the strict discipline written on the pine board. Not a single habit was shortened. Not a single chore neglected just because the weather had grown harsher. If anything, every task became more deliberate and unwavering than ever. Instead of complaints, the numbers began changing. 18 eggs. 2 days later, 24. The next count reached 31. Kestrel paused only long enough to record each total before continuing with the morning chores. The flock had learned its rhythm, and rhythm disappeared quickly when neglected. Then came another clear morning, after a night of bitter cold. She moved from one nesting box to the next, wrapping each egg in linen before placing it into the basket hanging from her arm. The basket grew heavy. When she reached the final row, there was no room left. Kestrel returned to the cabin without a word, took down the second basket that had belonged to her father, and finished the collection. 37 eggs from 89 hens that had once stood silent inside an auction crate. The warmth rising from the fresh eggs drifted through the freezing air like proof that needed no witness. She marked the number on the pine board. Eggs. 37. Outside, winter remained exactly as harsh as it had been the day before. The wind had not softened. The nights had not grown shorter. The difference lay elsewhere. The season had stripped away every careless habit, every overlooked crack, every weak routine. What remained was a system built to meet the cold, instead of hoping to escape it. Kestrel carried both baskets into the cabin, and placed the second one beside Mother Ansel's bed. The old woman rested one hand on the warm linen, covering the eggs. She looked at her daughter, then toward the window, where snow still covered the yard. A quiet nod was all she offered. Nothing else needed saying. The hens had answered the town more clearly than words ever could. 3 days later, Kestrel wrapped 24 eggs in clean linen, packed them into a willow basket, and drove to the stagecoach kitchen. Travelers filled the room with the smell of wet wool and melting snow. Breakfast had nearly emptied the pantry. Fresh eggs had become harder to find with every colder morning. Nola Pike wiped her hands on her apron before walking to the counter. She did not ask where the eggs came from. She picked up one shell and held it toward the window, turning it slowly beneath the pale winter light. Her thumb pressed gently against the surface before she cracked it into a white enamel bowl. The yolk settled high and round. Its color leaned deep toward gold instead of pale yellow. The white stayed close instead of spreading across the bowl. Nola looked at it for several quiet moments. Years spent feeding hungry travelers had taught her that good food explained itself. She glanced back at Kestrel. "How many can you bring every week?" Kestrel had already done the arithmetic on the pine board at home. She answered with a number lower than the flock's current production. A few eggs would always remain on the farm. Storms could delay a day. Winter might still claim another chicken. Promises should leave room for the unexpected. Nola nodded once. "Bring that many every Thursday." She reached across the counter and closed Kestrel's fingers around the agreed payment. Before lifting the basket toward the kitchen, she picked up one of the eggs again. "These will hold a man through morning." Nothing more needed to be said. Outside, the cold wind still crossed the street exactly as it had the week before. Yet one small basket had just turned 89 forgotten hens into something the frontier valued above rumor, a dependable meal. The next stop stood only a few buildings away. Bramcock looked up as the store door opened and admitted a gust of cold air along with Kestrel. She carried another basket to the worn wooden counter and lifted away the linen cloth without speaking. For a long moment, Bram studied the eggs instead of the woman who had brought them. Their shells were clean. Their sizes matched closely enough to show careful sorting. Nothing about them resembled the worn-out flock everyone had laughed about only weeks before. The room stayed unusually quiet. Hiram stood beside the cast-iron stove, warming his hands. He watched without offering the jokes that had once come so easily. Bram picked up an egg, turned it over once, then set it back into the basket.
50 eggs.
"I can sell these." Kestrel named the number she could deliver each week. He nodded. "I'll keep a place on the shelf." The agreement ended with a simple handshake. Before Kestrel reached the door, Hiram cleared his throat. "Wait." She stopped and turned. He stepped to the counter and counted out enough coins for 12 eggs. His eyes remained on the basket rather than on Kestrel. "My wife needs good food." That was all. No apology crossed the room. None was requested. Kestrel wrapped the dozen carefully and handed them over. Hiram accepted the package with both hands, almost as gently as someone carrying medicine. When she walked back into the winter air, the bell above Bram's door rang softly behind her. The same store where the first rumors had grown now held the first basket of her eggs for sale. Nothing in the building had changed, except the evidence resting on the counter. Sometimes that was enough to change everything else. The following Sunday, after the morning service, Deacon Lorne Bell stopped at the Vale cabin with an empty wagon and an uneasy expression. Several families had reached the end of their winter stores sooner than expected. Flour had grown scarce. Salt pork had been stretched too many times. The church planned to cook one hot meal before the next supply wagon could fight its way through the drifts. "We need eggs," he said simply. Kestrel carried 2 baskets onto the porch. One held the strongest, most even eggs promised to regular buyers. The second contained smaller ones, and a handful with hairline cracks in the shell. Still perfectly fresh, but unlikely to travel well. Lorne pointed toward the smaller basket. "We'll take those too." Kestrel shook her head. "You'll pay for the sound ones." She lifted the cracked eggs into his basket herself. "These should be cooked first." Nothing in her voice suggested charity. It sounded more like instructions for storing firewood before a storm. The deacon understood. He thanked her, covered the baskets with clean cloth, and drove away toward the church where warm food would soon replace another evening of empty tables. When Kestrel told Mother Ansel where the extra eggs had gone, the old woman rested quietly beneath her quilt. She looked toward the coop, where steady clucking drifted through the cold afternoon air. A faint smile touched her face. "Your father would have eaten one slow." Kestrel smiled back for only a moment before pulling on her coat again. The flock still needed fresh water before sunset. Outside, winter remained every bit as cold as before. Yet the hens that had once been dismissed as worthless were now helping feed neighbors who had never imagined they would depend on them. Their value had never been hidden inside the price paid at the auction. It had been waiting inside the chance to recover. A few days later, Orpha Maines walked slowly through the Vale gate carrying nothing except a pair of worn leather gloves. She stopped outside the coop and listened before speaking. "I can't keep my bedding dry." Kestrel opened the door. There was no lecture waiting inside. She pointed first to the narrow vent tucked beneath the sheltered side of the roof. "Damp air has to leave." Next came the thin layer of wood ash beneath the straw. "It catches moisture before the bedding does." The lower roosts followed, then the water pan against the inner wall, and finally the trays of sprouted grain resting where mice could not reach them. Orpha knelt and pressed her hand into the bedding. The straw felt warm enough to flex and dry enough to rustle instead of clumping together. She stayed there for several silent seconds. "I've been fighting the cold," she admitted at last. Kestrel looked toward the open prairie. So has everyone. Winter had not changed. The lesson had. When Orpha left that afternoon, she carried no eggs with her. She carried several better questions instead, and by the following week, a small roof vent had appeared above her own coop. By the time winter began loosening its grip on Crowbone Crossing, the pine board beside the coop door had filled with charcoal marks from top to bottom. They told an honest story. 82 hens had returned to steady production. Several others lived comfortably in a separate pen, eating well but laying little or nothing. A few never recovered enough to produce again, yet they remained healthy enough to scratch through the straw each morning. Kestrel never erased those facts. Real work had no reason to pretend perfection. She stepped outside before sunrise, as she had done every day since bringing the flock home from the auction. Frost still silvered the yard, though the mornings no longer bit quite as hard. Brindle stretched beside the porch before taking his familiar place near the coop door. Inside the cabin, Mother Ansel sat wrapped in her quilt, listening through the open window. The chicken house answered the morning with a low, steady chorus. Soft clucking, gentle scratching, the quiet conversation of chickens beginning another ordinary day. Months earlier, that sound had been missing. Now it filled the little building without effort. Kestrel stood for a moment, hearing it wash through the weathered boards, before reaching for the willow basket hanging beside the door. The eggs would cool if they stayed in the nest too long. She walked inside the coop without hurry. Winter had made its judgment. The town had made its own. Neither verdict mattered as much as the simple truth waiting beneath the hens. The flock had never needed someone to believe in them. They had needed someone willing to understand what they required, then keep providing it long after hope alone would have grown tired. The coop had found its voice again, and every warm egg resting in the basket carried a little of that quiet answer home.